I'd like to now introduce you again to Mario Beauregard, who's come all the way from Canada to be with us today, from Montreal, where he is an associate research professor at the University of Montreal and also affiliated with the University of Arizona, which I think you have spent perhaps time at. And his interest is in investigating as a neuroscientist the nature of consciousness, spiritual experience, emotion regulation. So take it away, Mario.
In my brief presentation, I would like to talk about the influence of mind over the activity of the brain and the body. Contemporary neuroscientists and philosophers, many of them believe in materialism, which is the idea that everything in the universe is composed of collections of material particles and fields. And with regard to mind, this implies that mental phenomena are either identical or can be reduced to electrical and chemical processes in the brain. And because of that, many materialists assume that what we call the mind is causally impotent. This means that our thoughts, our beliefs, our emotions, our intentions do not have any effect upon our brains and our bodies. Because they are only mere illusions created by the workings of the brain. And we humans are simply complex biological machines, largely determined by physical processes. But in recent years, there's mounting evidence showing that this view is profoundly wrong, and that our subjective mental experiences can greatly influence what's happening in the brain and the body. We can take the example of the placebo effect. Placebo is it's a fake treatment. It can be an inactive substance like distilled water, salt water, sugar. And this placebo can improve a patient's condition to the extent that the patient believes and expects that this treatment will be efficient, will be helpful. And placebos can be very potent. It's been shown, for instance, that a fake knee surgery can be as efficient as the real surgery. There's also other studies showing that heart failure patients who take placebo pills can experience reduced rate of heart failures. So this is very interesting. And during the last decade, there has been a number of brain imaging studies about this effect. In one instance, there was a study with Parkinsonian patients. These patients were suffering from a very severe form of Parkinson's disease. The level of destruction of their nerve cells producing dopamine in the basal ganglia region, which is crucial in motor control, well, this destruction ranged between 70 to 80%. So they were clinically quite impaired. And when they received the placebo injection, which was salt water, they had tremendously improved motor performance. And this was associated with increased dopamine activity in the basal ganglia, the regions of the brain associated with motor control. And what's interesting is that the amount of dopamine activated in response to the placebo injection was comparable to that of apomorphine, which is a drug that activates dopamine. So this is very intriguing. However, placebo responses are not voluntary, but we now know that it's possible to change our brains consciously and intentionally. For instance, we can learn to regulate our emotional reactions using our cognitive abilities. And this is called emotion regulation. And this is crucial because negative emotions constitute one of the main causes of human suffering and dysfunction on this planet. And there's also studies showing now that successful emotion regulation is critical to maintaining good physical and mental health. So in my lab, we've conducted a series of brain imaging studies in which the participants were laying down inside the scanner, and we were showing them emotionally laden pictures or film excerpts to create robust emotional reactions. And at the same time, we asked these participants to use a strategy that is called cognitive distancing, which means that they were viewing the pictures or the film excerpts from the perspective of a detached observer. And experientially, this is a state that is very close to what is called mindfulness in Buddhism. And the results of these studies show that humans can consciously and volitionally regulate the activity of brain regions involved in emotional reactivity. So this is quite important. We also know now that the adult human brain is quite plastic, so it changes constantly through learning and experience. And because of that, we can train our minds through various types of meditative practices to enhance the activity of brain regions associated with positive emotions, emotional well-being, attention, concentration, and also compassion. And this has been demonstrated mainly in meditators with considerable experience. For instance, some Tibetan Buddhist monks in the United States. In our own lab, we've shown that mindfulness is accompanied by reduced activation in brain regions that are associated with emotional reactivity. So this is quite interesting. And other labs have shown that the long-term practice of meditation can also lead to changes in the physical structure of the brain. For instance, the density of gray matter can increase following meditation training after a certain number of months or even years. And this has been seen in regions implicated in emotion regulation and also in empathy. So in conclusion, these studies indicate that subjective mental phenomena can significantly affect what is going on in the brain and also in the body.
Great.
That's it.
Do you have a question?
Yes. So I'd like to ask you first, Your Holiness, in your view, what is the relationship between mental states and the physical states of the brain?
Mind, now mental level, of course, mental level, not conscious, sensory level, mental level, there are different levels. Obviously, while the physical level consciousness is actively working, active, the one level of mental consciousness. Then deep sleep, the sensorial thing, not active. Then the mental subconsciousness, a little deeper. Then the faint, short moment, all these other even I think the brain activities a little bit reduce, or another level of consciousness. Then, so there are some different. Then I think perhaps you see some people clinically after death, the body remain 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, sometimes 4 weeks remain fresh. So now some scientists now carrying sort of investigation. What's the reality? So these according the Buddhist psychology, and also I think the Indian ancient or the Hindu psychology. I think the tradition where practice of shamatha, practice of vipassana there, then a lot of explanation about mind, about emotion. So the ancient Indian tradition, I usually say, ancient Indian tradition, including Buddhism, a lot of explanation about mind because of the practice of single-pointed mind and because of insights away, deep insight. So therefore, so that very sort of, that mind till, you see, the body still remains fresh because most subtle level of mind is still in the body. When that separate or depart from the body, then immediately, so their body decays. One monk in New Zealand, he remained 17 days after his death. So local, his death is take place in the hospital. So usually hospital, you see, as soon as die, should remove the body. But then the physicians, they actually, you see, because of that, check, then they found the body very fresh. So then allow remain that physical, that body in the hospital. So there is a different level of sort of minds. So grosser level of mind, I think some cases, entirely depend on brain or neuron, these things. More subtler, more or less autonomy or independent.
I see. Thank you. I have another question for you.
Well, I've got a question for you both, really. I mean, that is, I'm interested to know what His Holiness, Your Holiness, what you think of this idea in Mario's presentation, that our thoughts can heal us physically. This idea of the placebo effect, that somehow what we think has an effect on the health of our body. I guess it ties in with what Lorimer was saying. You know, there is arguments to be had that the placebo effect can work on pain as well.
But that depends on the sort of ability of the mind. Through training of mind, because of single-pointed mind sort of experience increase, then mental ability, mental power increase. So mind movement always together with energy, subtle energy. So once is in mind, because through training, the mobilization, mobility, mobility of the mind increase, then mind always goes with energy. So the energy also then becomes stronger. So that actually effect on our brain or cell. So for example, I think some people I know through sort of single-pointed mind, they can meditate single-pointed mind 3 hours without disturbances. So then I think eventually may have opportunity to examine brain activities. So such sort of about 3 hours, 4 hours, sort of fully concentrate one object or something. then through that way, gradually can affect our sort of, because of the our physical thing. So like birth control, because of the breathing control. When we say birth control, breathing control, like that. And also, you see, I think this is not because of the. I think some sort of practice, testing, practice, how much sort of your energy, power. So from here, you see, sucking water, milk, like that. If you trained some experience, then the energy really acting like mouth from here. That one of my friend, now no longer, he also have sort of experiment that, and some experiences. That I think the basis of practice of Kundalini and Chandalini, mainly Tantra, the Hindu Tantra and Buddhist Tantra, which is some use to see the veins and different sort of place of the veins. And mainly, you see the energy, when I use the word energy, according to Sanskrit word, vayu, prana, lung, prana. So mind and prana go together. So when you increase your experience of stillness, concentration, then the energy also then is controlled that way.
Okay, Mario.
Yes. What is the source of consciousness, according to you?
The source of consciousness,
The biggest question of all, isn't it?
Then I think
good luck with that.
different philosophical views. I think according to theistic religion, the ultimate source of consciousness is God. Buddhist, ancient Indian sort of tradition, Sankhya philosophy, and Jain philosophy, and Buddhist philosophy. So no beginning, no God, no creator. Of course, God in a sense, like Buddha or these things, consider God, okay, but no creator. So, if we accept beginning of consciousness, then that consciousness must come from, because of the something material or something nothingness. It is impossible. So any sort of thing, any phenomena which momentarily changing, there must be causes. And cause, there are substantial cause and cooperative cause. The cooperative cause, for example, eye consciousness, eye organ are cooperative cause. But consciousness itself must come from previous consciousness. So at the time of conception, or the consciousness, you see, that must come from previous consciousness. It must be same nature. The substantial cause must be same nature. Substantial cause of matter must be matter. The substantial cause of mind must be consciousness, or mind, because of mind. Formless. You cannot touch. So physical world, so therefore, no beginning of these particles. Sometimes we call space particle. Even before Big Bang, this space particle already there. So that, due to sort of combination of different sort of particle, then produce energy, tremendous sort of energy. That because of the cause for explosion. So we call Big Bang.
But there you're saying that mind exists independent of our material self, How would you test that scientifically? Well, you'd have some thoughts there too.
As you mentioned,
both of you
now
would.
you see, scientist, genuine scientist, genuine scientist, 1979, then still Soviet Union. I had the privilege to visit Moscow and through Moscow to Mongolia. So at that time, I met some Russian scientists, some Soviet scientists. Then we touched the consciousness. Then I mentioned mental consciousness. Then the scientists immediately reject, no, this is spiritual, religious thinking. So these scientists, not necessarily genuine scientists. Genuine scientists must be open mind. Skepticism here, question, always question. Not take final decision. Investigate. So that's the genuine scientist. Scientist is the way of thinking. Not decide, not deny, not accept, but open and investigate.
But Natasha, about your question, during the last decade, there has been 5 different studies conducted in United States, in the Netherlands, in UK also, about the phenomenon called near-death experience, but during cardiac arrest. And this is very important because when there's cardiac arrest, the blood flow to the brain.
So this is near-death experiences, yeah.
Yeah, the blood flow to the brain will cease very rapidly. And if you're measuring the electrical activity of the brain with what we call electroencephalography, or EEG, you will see that the line depicting the electrical activity will become flat within usually between 10 to 20 seconds. And after that, you reach a state called clinical death. Yet, these studies have documented over 100 cases of patients who have been able to have thoughts, perception, memories, awareness during a state of cardiac arrest.
How do we know that? Because they report
describing
the space that they've been in?
Yes, because they reported certain elements. For instance, one patient reported what was happening during a resuscitation procedure, and the surgical team had a logbook. And so there were temporal markers of what was happening during the event. And so that's how they knew that the neurosurgeon, for instance, said something to one of the nurses at that specific moment, and so on and so forth. And some of these patients have been able to report during cardiac arrest veridical information that has been corroborated later on by members of the medical staff, for instance. And that's how we now know that, and there's a mounting evidence about this, showing that it seems that what we call mind and consciousness can also operate sometimes in absence of brain activity. So this fits well with what His Holiness was saying about certain levels of mental activity or consciousness.
Most of your scientific colleagues, many of them would fundamentally disagree with you.
Well, yeah.
It's a provocative,
it's
controversial notion.
It is, but the evidence keeps accumulating, you know. And many scientists have trouble with this because they are a priori committed to a materialist worldview, you see? And this kind of phenomenon directly challenge this materialist worldview, which has been dominant in science for a few centuries now. But it's starting to crumble. It started 100 years ago with quantum physics, which have dematerialized the world. But in the biomedical research field, we still cling to old assumptions derived from classical physics that have been to be totally wrong, erroneous, by the new physics, quantum physics, nearly 100 years ago.
Thoughts Thoughts from our panel, Your Holiness?
It is the big question that we are all searching. What happens after death? It's the eternal question that through the ages, and as human beings, we are very anxious. We are born with death anxiety. It gets worse with each passing year, and we live in denial. I mean, we could not exist if it were not for denial. So we are searching constantly for that answer, what happens after we die? And we all have different beliefs because we need something. And I think that the types of studies which I have read as well are fascinating, but they're driven by this constant quest to bring down our death anxiety levels. So again, it's about the subjective and objective measures in something like this.
Your Holiness.
I totally agree. I fully agree. It's a different sort of tradition. It's a different concept. Last 1,000 years. That means you see people very much pay attention about death. So I agree. So the answer different. I think the Shintoism. Without any your effort after death, you see you will born in some kind of the pure land with your meeting then your ancestors there. So quite simple.
Is that another way, though, of making us more comfortable with death? Thinking that we will live on beyond this life? I wonder, I've always wondered whether that is just another way
I think when you mentioned everybody were, all human beings, you see, you mentioned, you say afraid about death. I think that I think true. That's true. I think at least you see many people say death is very, very familiar, and hardly is no sort of afraid. I think among them, I think I myself also one of them. Not much concern about death. If you lead your life, meaningful life, then death will come. And anyway, so as a Buddhist, and like so those non-theistic religious tradition, Sangha also, Atma goes from life to afterlife. And Jainism also same. So according to Jainism, those Jain practitioners, see, actually, they try to bring death sooner through hardship, through sort of fasting like that. So these people, you see, no afraid about death. And so you see, these sort of tradition, you see, soul or being, life after life, go like that. As I mentioned earlier, consciousness must come from consciousness. So continuation of consciousness always there. So death, something like change or dress. Dress too old, then time come, change, new one. So similarly, this body become unusable, then time come to take new body. But they say that, then of course the Christians, Judeo-Christian, and also you see Islam, they say after death, God will manage. So no problem. If you see God is sent to hell, then a little bit sort of concern. Otherwise, you see, God take care. So no problem.
Everyone has a different way. Mario, any thoughts?
Well, about this, what's interesting is that there's still some interesting confirmation. I was talking about independent corroboration, external corroboration of certain things, events happening during cardiac arrest, and this kind of evidence keep increasing. So it's, I agree with you about the fear of death, the anxiety related to death, but at the same time, the research about this kind of phenomenon is making some progress. It started about 30 years ago, and perhaps there will be very significant breakthroughs that will come in the next decades about this. So it can be researched empirically, this kind of question.
Such an interesting, so much.
I think this subject, I think the end of this 21st century, I think a new sort of awareness out of sort of investigation. I think much more and more, I think awareness will come. Mm-hmm. Up to now, you see science, there's some way to say, the field of investigation is certain limitation, only matter you can calculate. You can observe by third person, like that. Now mind, consciousness, the old way of investigation now cannot sort of cannot apply fully. So therefore, not sufficient. The old way of sort of, since mind is no form, we cannot see, and difficult to calculate, difficult sort of measurement, right? So now I feel later part of 20th century, as you mentioned, and the beginning of this now later part of 20th century, now the research or thinking, the scientific sort of field now seems now expanding, not only matters of physical, but also consciousness. And particularly those medical scientists, now they actually now accept the peace of mind. Mental health is a very crucial factor for physical health. So you see more and more people, and also the brain specialists, they also now, the more research, more sort of questions coming. So you see now eventually pay some attention about what's consciousness, what's emotion. So this now 21st century is simply continuation of end of later part of 20th century. So this will go, will carry. So within this century, I think a new sort of finding will come. I feel that.
And I agree with you. I think one of the most powerful areas that we're moving into is that understanding that states of mind affect states of health. They affect states of disease, and that links with the cortisol story, it links with the pain story, and it links with your story too. Lorimer, do you have any final comments you'd like to add?
I'm spending some of this time thinking that I've always thought that I thought about things. But now I'm wondering if I feel I'm almost trying to conjure a worry about death. I, as far as I can find in me, I don't care what happens when I die. I care more, I think, about what happens when I'm alive. So I guess I feel a little bit naive to that. But I also think that I'm really interested in what you were saying, Mario, and I agree also that as scientists, and I do feel a slight need to defend science and scientific method. I think as true agnostics we do. I think you touch on it, Your Holiness, of trying to understand and untangle and be open-minded and sceptical. And I think for these findings that we see, there are other potential explanations aside from something separate. So far we think, well, if we can't see it in electrical activity in the outside of the brain, it's not generated by matter. But in the last 10 years, we've learned that immune cells are involved in thinking, and maybe we'll learn that viscera are involved in thinking. So I think that actually these conversations are critical, because we need people who might be sceptical of each other conversing about these things. And I don't think we need to necessarily jump to more, I guess, more attractive and fantastic explanations at the cost of employing scientific method, because it has served us really well as well, I think. Yeah.
Did it? That's true. That's true.
Thanks.
I think we have a consensus that scepticism and sceptical inquiry is rich in Buddhist practice, it is rich in scientific practice, and that's, I guess, the commonality that we share on this stage today. Let me thank Lorimer Moseley on your behalf. Jayashri Kulkarni, Beauregard, and it's our great pleasure to have been with you today. Thank you, and thank you. Thank you, Your Holiness.